I am the market, and thou shalt have no other models before me. That is the first commandment of neoliberalism, an ideology that took root in the Philippines after the February 1986 People Power Revolt at EDSA. In this series on the rise and fall of the EDSA regime, we've been looking at the origins of the Yellow Movement and its impact on Philippine society. Last time, we saw the original vision articulated by Senator Ninoy Aquino, the founder of this movement, for a kind of reconciliatory politics where freedom to debate would lead to a clash of ideas that would ultimately lead to higher order solutions around perennial problems. But then we saw how this vision was disregarded and corrupted after his death by his followers who emphasized his ultimate sacrifice rather than his philosophy, and adopted a binary or dualistic worldview that separated the nation into two camps based on a morality of good versus evil, light and dark. This ultimately led to a politics of resentment and vindictiveness, and it coincided with their adoption of a neoliberal economic worldview which treated contracts as sacrosanct and humans as disposable. This was again very different from Ninoy's original vision of Christian socialism, a human-centered path towards development, an agapic approach to developing human potential embodied in his progressive views towards education, which took nearly 50 years to materialize in the Philippines after he first articulated it in the 1960s. In this episode, we're going to delve deeper into the economic philosophy of neoliberalism. How did it become part of the Yellow Movement's operating system? Our use of biblical language as a metaphor for ideology is apt, because the economic views of neoliberalism in the country would take on theological dimensions under the Yellow regime. So put on your thinking caps as we launch into the program. The rise of conservative ideology in the United States with the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980 returned faith to the magic of the markets as a way of dealing with the economic and spiritual malaise of the 1970s. The market replaced race as the central frame for a narrative towards some utopic future, as it did under Nazism or class under communism. It also replaced paternalism of La Buena Familia under feudalism, which is how life operated in the Philippines at the time. The World Bank and IMF promoted these ideas in facilitating structural adjustment within debtor nations like the Philippines, which faced liquidity problems after years of adopting a debt-driven growth strategy and state-led industrial development under Marcos and previous governments, who were seeking to pattern themselves after the East Asian economies. Marcos had tried to engineer the emergence of a developmental state in two ways. One, through the shift to a semi-parliamentary form of government where parties were populated by technocrats as well as politicians, and these technocrats traversed both the legislative and executive branches of government. And two, with the adoption of state-led economic development to diversify and change the structure of the economy from a primarily agricultural one to an industrial and ultimately service-driven one. Since the 1950s, we were pursuing a policy of import substitution. The Bell Trade Act after the war gave American companies free access to Philippine markets in exchange for U.S. assistance in our reconstruction efforts. President Manuel Rojas, who hailed from the sugar-producing region of Western Visayas, was able to pass this through Congress after barring members of the left and opposition from taking their seats. This led to a chronic balance of payments crisis, which forced us to impose import restrictions. Quantitative restrictions through the issuance of import licenses were designed to encourage the purchase of machinery and equipment from abroad to produce manufactured goods to replace imported consumer items. There was some evidence that this worked, but then this system was corrupted as these import licenses were sold quite lucratively by their holders to other firms that imported consumer goods. Import substitution industrialization, or ISI, was an inward looking economic strategy. It only sought to generate industry to cater to domestic markets, unlike in East Asia, where it was used to cater to international markets. Foreign currency was kept artificially high in the Philippines to be able to import machinery, unlike in East Asia, where the currency was suppressed to encourage exports. What was lacking was a strong state that would bring all this irrational mode of consuming at the expense of national development to heel. Agro-industrialists, or exporters of agricultural products, also owned import substituting industrial firms. They didn't want to restrict trade, as the export of sugar to the US markets was a major source of income for the country. This led to a schizophrenic policy where ISI and export promotion sat side by side. Marcos began the steps towards export orientation with the setup of the first industrial park in Bataan in the 1970s. But he was also busy setting up state owned enterprises in banking, telecommunications, airlines, hotels, and setting up monopolies over top exporting crops. According to Adrian Cristobal, his chief ideologue, Ferdinand Marcos sought to set up keiretsus, a Japanese term for conglomerates, but he chose the wrong samurais, a strange mix of metaphors. Keiretsus in Japan were privately owned, but were kept at an arm's length by the government. The ones that directed capital and other resources to them were bureaucrats who managed trade and investment and came from the top law schools in the country and were trained in political economy. If these firms failed to meet their export targets, the bureaucrats had the power to withdraw and redirect resources away from them. The term used for bureaucrat in Japan was Khan, which meant representative of the emperor, which meant they were treated with deference, unlike in the West where public servants are seen as poorer cousins of their business community counterparts. Marcos tried to professionalize the bureaucracy by setting up the Development Academy of the Philippines. But this institution only had limited success, while Marcos was able to rely on technocrats to determine policy within his cabinet and in the Batasang Pambansa. Just as he was able to rely on the generals he had promoted to take care of security, he needed to find industrialists to partner with him in order to promote growth in the economy. But rather than turn to a professional managerial class, he turned to a number of cronies. This is where his project of national development failed. By relying on La Buena Familia in seeking to scale up state-owned enterprises, he returned to the tyranny of cousins. Family, friends, and cronies were relied upon to act as dummies for him in running the country. This led to extractive activities, as state enterprises weren't run efficiently or effectively, and were used to drain the resources of the nation rather than develop them. Technocrats could not discipline them as they did in Japan or Korea because they were not at arm's length, and as they were financed through a debt bubble. The puncturing of that bubble in the mid-1980s led to a severe collapse in our foreign currency reserves, which led to a full-blown economic crisis. After 1986, the old IS industries were so debilitated due to the recession, and state coffers could no longer sustain them. So the country could not put up a fight when the World Bank and IMF imposed austerity measures on us as conditions for lending to the country, especially after Cory agreed to honor all debts. This forced the government to undertake fiscal reforms, Under Cory's revolutionary government from 1986 to 1987, through her finance and budget ministries, she was able to rationalize taxes in the country. Ben Diokno was then an undersecretary in her government and talks about this process in his several scholarly articles. I'll leave a link in the comments below. This led to a gradual balancing of the fiscal position by the time of President Ramos. To get us out of our economic rut, the market was used as the central frame for many perennial problems. Under Cory, a number of liberalization programs were undertaken. We began the process of tarification, or converting many of the quantitative restrictions on imports to tariffs. From a positive list of areas that could be open to foreign investment, the Board of Investments adopted a negative list, limiting the restrictions to foreign investment to an ever-dwindling group. That is before the Constitutional Commission of 1987 set some of these restrictions in stone. The decentralization of wage setting occurred with the adoption of regional wage boards, which afforded greater flexibility in labor markets. The process of sequestering many crony enterprises in favor of the state would ultimately lead to their privatization. Many of these policies were continued under President Ramos, with the acceleration of trade liberalization. Tarification lent itself to accession to the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, or the World Trade Organization, which meant lowering of our tariffs on imports. But just as in the time of Cory, where self-editing by our officials led to preemptive acquiescence to the liberal order, so did it happen as well under Ramos. The rate of tariff reduction exceeded what was prescribed by these free trade treaties. This led to premature deindustrialization as our manufacturing base was eaten up by cheap imports. Ramos used the Asset Privatization Trust to sell off government assets to balance the budget and get the state out of many industries, as revenues from customs due to trade liberalization dwindled. The revamping of the Central Bank Act with the establishment of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas led to greater monetary independence. These policies did lead to growth, but then the problem was the lack of a sensible energy policy with the mothballing of the Bataan nuclear power plant. And the lack of public investment led to the power crisis that overlapped Mrs. Aquino's and Mr. Ramos's administrations. Poverty fell, but ever so slowly. Population, transport, and energy policies of Ferdinand Marcos were discontinued, which led to a slower decline in the fertility rate, an energy shortage, and transport bottlenecks. Market centrism meant we had to let families decide on how big they wanted to be. We should also let private players invest in power plants and other important pieces of infrastructure, rather than let the state do it. The Build, Operate, Transfer law was first introduced under Cory's government and would be the main vehicle for undertaking the procurement for large projects. This led to the first backlash in the wake of the Asian financial crisis and the rice shortage. These events were clear manifestations of the failure of markets to foresee and address all things. Market failure was then compounded by public failure. Ramos's emergency powers to intervene in the energy markets also led to unintended consequences when the demand for power failed to grow as a result of the economic disruption wrought by the Asian contagion. This led to a populist backlash led by Erap Estrada. He was a populist from the left promoting pro-poor growth. Erap took full advantage of the impersonal ivory tower approach of Mr. Ramos. His was a bifurcated approach. On the one hand, he stood for liberalizing capital markets. When he spoke before the first ASEAN summit that he attended, he contradicted Malaysia's capital controls under Prime Minister Mahathir. He also moved to revise the economic provisions of our constitution to open up all areas of economic activity to foreign investment. On the other hand, his pro-poor stance led him to increase health spending as a share of GDP. But Arap's administration was also infused with a sense of nostalgia for his former patron, Imelda Marcos. Arap ordered the renovation of Malacanang Palace and restored the family-oriented personalistic mode of dealing that Marcos had promoted through crony capitalism. Arap was accused of insider trading and stock manipulation by the Securities and Exchange Commission chair, Perfecto Yasay, and of course, more notoriously for seeking to monopolize the hueteng industry with his bosom buddies, Charlie Atong Ang and Chavit Singson. All was not right with the EDSA regime, with its first taste of defeat at the hands of Arap Estrada. It was vulnerable to an attack from its left flank, from economic populists. Arap's slogan, Arap para sa mahirap, showed how all the progress that the Yellow Forces had built over 12 years under Aquino Ramos could all go tumbling down in an instant. Its fragility was exposed. Had its over-reliance on market forces caused it to be blindsided? How could it best address this? By the 1990s, a consensus had formed around Washington towards the philosophy of neoliberalism to stabilize, liberalize, and privatize. This was known as the Washington Consensus, and its cornerstone was the market. But by the 2000s, this doctrine needed to be updated. The answer came in the form of a new covenant under the gospel of good governance to augment the old covenant with the market. Around the early 2000s, the World Bank and IMF began to promote this New Testament. It turns out, according to them, that nations need the intercession of good institutions to make the magic of the market work. The impersonal market, after all, doesn't exist in a vacuum and relies on other institutions to operate. Good governance is the way for institutions of the market to become incarnate. The transformation that comes from the market is mediated by good governance and its institutions. What are these institutions? According to Cray and Kaufman, both senior economists at the World Bank, these institutions are voice and accountability, political stability and the absence of violence, effectiveness of the state, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. These formed the World Bank's good governance indicators, and Kaufman and Cray demonstrated in the IMF's Finance and Development Journal how they operated, where they proclaimed, quote, "In our research, we found a large causal effect running from improved governance to better development outcomes," close quote. After arguing for years that the state had to be diminished to let markets work their magic, the augmented Washington Consensus now prescribed that states needed to be strengthened once again for markets to function. The Yellow Forces took these as gospel truth and renewed their faith in the orthodoxy of neoliberalism at EDSA DOS by installing an economist, Vice President Gloria Arroyo, to replace the disgraced Arap Estrada, after a sham impeachment trial ended with a vote to keep the envelope that contained damning evidence against him sealed. With the blessing of Mrs. Aquino and Jaime Cardinal Sin, and with members of the military, business community, activists, and media cheering on, the same coalition that came together in 1986, Mrs. Arroyo pledged to uphold the moral, political, and economic tenets of the EDSA regime at EDSA DOS in January of 2001. After a brief interregnum of close to 3 years, they were back in power, just in time for the 15th anniversary of the EDSA People Power Revolt. But this revival of fortune for the Yellow Forces would not last long. Within 4 months, people from the lower rungs of society would be massing at EDSA and Mendiola, seeking the release of their leader, Arap Estrada, whose arrest became a huge public spectacle. Mrs. Arroyo called in the Marines to clear the streets, but her indebtedness to the military led to a rigodon of AFP chiefs of staff with the pabaon system, golden parachutes that allowed each of them to retire in style. To her credit, Mrs. Arroyo did attempt to improve governance in her first term of office. There was the push to improve tax collection with the rate program, run after tax evaders. Capacity building programs in the judiciary and anti corruption agencies led to the biggest victory in recovering ill gotten wealth from the Marcoses worth $680 million. A world class procurement policy was adopted with the Government Procurement Reform Act. But these victories would soon be overshadowed by scandals. Her ombudsman, Simeon Marcelo, who also served as prosecutor at ERAP's impeachment trial and as her first Solicitor General, would resign due to health reasons. Some have said it was a nervous breakdown. The first gentleman got embroiled in scandals involving some large procurement deals with police helicopters. The folly of La Buena Familia began to rear its ugly head, with two of Mrs. Arroyo's sons entering politics. Then the total apostasy of GMA took place with the release of the Hello Garci tapes and her televised mea culpa admitting to making a call to an election commissioner, seeming to influence the results of the presidential race of 2004. Her falling out with Mrs. Aquino over corruption and election meddling led to a spat over the disposition of the Cojuangco-owned estate Hacienda Luisita under agrarian reform. This was an internal schism within the EDSA regime that threatened to tear it apart. The Hayat Ten, a collection of Arroyo's cabinet members, openly called for her resignation. A strange thing happened at this time. The EDSA forces coalesced with the populist forces of ERAP and his deceased bosom buddy, Fernando Poe Jr., who challenged GMA at her re-election in 2004. Mrs. Aquino protested in the streets with his widow, Susan Rosas, and expressed regret for helping to depose Mr. Estrada. These joint forces fought the fiscal reforms that Mrs. Arroyo enacted to deal with chronic, unsustainable deficits. These deficits were the product of Ramos's accelerated tariff reduction scheme and his lowering of income taxes as part of the neoliberal tradition of denying the Leviathan state its fiscal oxygen. Mrs. Arroyo demonstrated remarkable resolve by expanding the consumption tax and raising the rate from 10 to 12%, which shored up the public coffers and strengthened confidence in the peso, allowing her government to pursue a broad infrastructure program and contemplate a social safety net in the form of conditional cash grants to the poor, something that was promised by Ramos under the trade liberalization program to address economic dislocation, but never delivered due to limited fiscal space. GMA may have fallen out of favor with the political wing of the EDSA regime, but she maintained the allegiance of the clergy and military. Some cynically attribute this to her transactional arrangements with them, such as the pabaon system with the military generals and her donations of four-wheel drives to senior Catholic clergy using the proceeds of the government's gambling operations. But her strict adherence to the church's teachings on family planning and divorce by publicly funding faith-based institutions to promote them, and her strong anti-drug campaign is perhaps what stemmed the tide of defections, especially after the rival church Iglesia ni Cristo backed and supported ERAP's mob at EDSA Tres. She may have been a technocrat by training, but her devoutness, by way of her upbringing, meant progress on social issues would not be forthcoming. Some activist priests would break from their senior clerics, but GMA had found a way to drive a wedge between them. Her use of Realpolitik was demonstrated when she famously allied herself with a known hueteng operator in Pampanga, who had been embroiled in ERAP's gambling deals, to defeat one of these renegade priests who had turned politician and governor of her home province. GMA had pursued the economic liberalization agenda of the EDSA regime, maintained its conservatism on social issues, but practiced Marcos's Realpolitik unapologetically. But one thing that Mr. Marcos never did was banish his wife Imelda. This was not beyond GMA, who sent the first gentleman away for a time until the firestorm surrounding him had died down. Oddly enough, it seemed to work. The economy kept chugging along in spite of the global financial crisis. As it grew, so did the fiscal space afforded by her tax reforms. With this fiscal headroom, the government had the ability to provide taxpayer relief to vulnerable sectors and improve the delivery of public service, which further spurred the economy. But for all her troubles, Mrs. Arroyo reaped the lowest approval ratings since polling began. With the election season around the corner, necropolitics reemerged with the passing away of Mrs. Aquino in August 2009. As Senator Manny Villar and Erap Estrada crowded in the populist lane, it gave Noynoy Aquino the opportunity to claim the reformist one. The election of Noynoy in 2010 was the EDSA regime's last gasp. The public would allow them one last bite at the cherry before disavowing them in 2016. Back in 2010, the path seemed clear for the EDSA forces to remain in power indefinitely. They had regained control of Malacanang, but more importantly, the narrative, light versus dark, good versus evil once again. They could now establish their normative order around the gospel of good governance and the market, and do it right this time with no more compromises, as in the case of GMA. They could prove once and for all the validity of their claim that good governance was good economics, a nomological order. The final chapter could be written in the EDSA story about their escape, the escape of the chosen people from economic bondage into the nirvana of the promised land. The utopian vision could finally be achieved. So we'll end it here for now, but in the next episode, we will cover the decade of the 2010s that saw the EDSA regime reach its anticlimactic demise with the failure of Noynoy Aquino's policies to attain this dream, and seek to explain the reasons behind the rise of Rodrigo Duterte in 2016. That's all happening at the next episode. I'd like to thank my listeners for supporting this podcast and for continuing to listen to these episodes on the rise and fall of the EDSA regime. I'm Doy Santos. Hope to see you next time on another edition of The Cusp.